We will speak now about what was done to the human template, how the original architecture was altered, what specifically was compressed, and why understanding this history changes everything about how the ground crew understands its own nature and the symptoms it has been carrying. Now we will look at the de-evolution timeline, what was compressed and what is now being restored. Before the compression happened is important to expand upon, so we will. What the ground crew is navigating right now, the sensitivity that is often overwhelming, the symptoms that do not resolve through conventional means, the growing incompatibility with environments and systems that once felt at least tolerable, becomes legible in a completely different way when you understand what was done to the human template, and when and by whom. We are going to speak about this history plainly because the starseed community has access to fragments of it from many directions, but rarely receives it as a coherent sequence. Our intention here is not to produce anger, nor to amplify the narrative of victimhood that the first band consciousness will instinctively reach for when this information is encountered. Our intention is precision, because understanding the specific nature of the compression allows you to understand the specific nature of the restoration, and the restoration is what everything in this transmission is ultimately oriented toward. So, let us expand where the story actually begins, not with the compression, but with what existed before it. The original human template was extraordinary by any measure available to your current science. 12 active strands of DNA, not 2, operating in concert to produce a being of remarkable multidimensional capacity. 12 corresponding energy centers, not 7, each one a receiver and transmitter for a specific band of the cosmic information field. The capacity for direct telepathic communion, not as a rare gift distributed to a few exceptional individuals, but as the ordinary baseline of human communication. The ability to access multiple dimensional realities simultaneously, in the same way that you currently access only one. Regenerative biological cycles that made what you currently call aging not a biological inevitability, but largely a matter of conscious choice. A direct, unmediated relationship with what we would call Source, not as a distant God to be appealed to, but as the immediate, palpable, ever-present intelligence within, and as the fabric of the human being's own experience. This was the original design. It was not mythological, it was not aspirational, it was functional, and it functioned in the civilizational corridor your traditions remember as the time before Atlantis fell. What your conventional science called junk is far from it, as many of you know. Before speaking of the compression itself, there is something in your current science that deserves a different name. Approximately 97% of the human genome has no identified protein coding function. The scientific community labeled this material non-functional, redundant, evolutionary remnant, junk. The naming was premature, and more recent biological inquiry has begun to recognize this, discovering that what was dismissed as inactive is in fact deeply involved in the regulatory architecture of which genes express under which conditions, in epigenetic programming, in the control of cellular behavior across a range of functions that are only beginning to be mapped. But the spiritual reality of this material extends well beyond what your biology can currently measure. What your science calls junk DNA is the dormant library. It is the compressed archive of the original 12-strand template. Not absent from your biology, not lost, not destroyed, but switched off. Deactivated at the level of expression while remaining present at the level of structure. Every human body walking your planet right now contains, within its own cellular architecture, the complete blueprint for the original multidimensional human design. The blueprint was never removed. Only the activation was suppressed. This is the literal biological situation of the human species. The original template is inside you right now, waiting in the structure of your own DNA for the precise conditions that will restore its expression. Those conditions are what the current solar activation sequence is delivering. Let's expand upon the compression event now. Approximately 300,000 years ago, in the deep history of your planet, long before your written records begin, a significant intervention occurred in the genetic and energetic architecture of the human species. A faction, operating with both technical capability and deliberate intent, restructured the human template in ways that served a specific purpose: the creation of a consciousness that could inhabit the human body and yet remain manageable, contained, incapable of accessing the full range of its own sovereign intelligence. The restructuring was not crude, it was precise. The upper 7 DNA strands, those associated with multidimensional perception, direct source communion, galactic memory, and the biological substrate for telepathy and regeneration, were disconnected from active expression. The 12 energy center system was contracted to 7 primary functional centers, with the 5 higher centers largely dormant. Most critically, for what we will discuss in the section that follows this one, the specific gland through which the higher frequency information had been received and distributed throughout the biological system was suppressed. Its crystalline structure gradually altered by the environmental conditions the intervention introduced, until its function as a dimensional interface was severely compromised. What remained was a capable, intelligent, emotionally sophisticated being, but one operating at a fraction of its original capacity, one that, crucially, could not easily perceive its own suppression, because the very faculties through which that perception would occur were among those that had been deactivated. A being that would, over time, interpret its limited bandwidth as the natural state of human existence, rather than as the artifact of a specific historical interference. And so, the belief systems began to form that humans are inherently limited, that the divine is external and must be appealed to from a position of unworthiness, that aging and disease are biological inevitabilities rather than consequences of a compromised template, that the inner life is unreliable as a source of navigation, that authority must come from outside the self. These are not the natural conclusions of the human experience. They are the installed operating parameters of the compressed template, firmware, written across thousands of years of carefully managed cultural conditioning that has maintained the suppression long after the original technical intervention receded from living memory. Why was this designed to be visible, then, you may ask? One of the more disorienting aspects of genuine awakening is the moment when the ground crew member begins to perceive the architecture of the control system clearly for the first time, and then realizes, with something between astonishment and vertigo, that it has always been visible, that it has been operating in plain sight across the full span of recorded history, that the symbols, the structures, the mechanisms of the suppression have been present in the cultural environment all along, and were simply illegible until the perceptual capacity to read them began to restore. This is not an accident. The control architecture was specifically designed to operate visibly for a precise reason. A compressed consciousness cannot recognize what it is seeing even when shown directly, because recognition requires the very faculties that have been suppressed. The system is its own camouflage. The suppression makes the suppression invisible. And so it could afford to be present in plain sight, because the perceptual instrument required to register it as what it is was the specific instrument that had been deactivated. This is why the activation of the dormant DNA strands, particularly those associated with pattern recognition, energetic discernment, and multidimensional sight, produces the experience that so many in your community have described. The sudden, disorienting clarity that comes with genuine awakening, the sense of seeing through surfaces that had previously appeared solid, the recognition of patterns in the cultural environment that were always present and are now suddenly undeniable. What changed is not the external environment. What changed is the receiver. The instrument has been restored enough to read a signal that was always broadcasting. And many of you are now pondering as to what the Atlantean collapse actually was. The civilization your traditions know as Atlantis occupies a significant place in this history, and it is worth being precise about what that place is. Atlantis was not simply an advanced human civilization that became arrogant and destroyed itself with technology beyond its wisdom. That reading is accurate as far as it goes, but misses the deeper mechanics of what occurred. What Atlantis represents in the genuine historical record is the first significant attempt, within the current civilizational cycle, to restore the original template, and the specific way in which that restoration failed. A large portion of the Atlantean civilization had achieved genuine recovery of aspects of the original 12-strand design. Not full restoration across the population, but sufficient restoration that certain individuals were functioning at capacities well beyond those of the compressed baseline. And this is where the failure occurred. The restored capacities, the abilities that flow naturally from the recovery of the upper DNA strands, were used by one faction within Atlantis, not in service of collective evolution, but in service of power. The ability to influence consciousness, to manipulate the biological systems of others, to command the energetic forces of the planetary field, these were turned toward control rather than toward the liberation of all. This is the specific lesson that the current restoration must not repeat. What is arriving in the ground crew's DNA right now is not primarily the restoration of extraordinary individual capability. It is the simultaneous restoration of capability and of the ethical coherence to wield it. The Atlantean failure was the activation of the upper strands without the corresponding development of the inner wisdom that those strands are designed to serve. The current corridor is deliberately structured differently. The restoration arriving through the solar activation sequence is not targeted at individual power. It is targeted at collective coherence. At the specific combination of restored perception and deepened heart-based governance that makes the higher capabilities genuinely safe, in the hands of beings who have understood, at the deepest level of their own experience, why Atlantis fell. The sequence of what is returning is quite exciting, beloved ones. The restoration of the original template is not arriving all at once, and understanding the sequence helps to make sense of what specific symptoms and capacities the ground crew is currently experiencing. The third and fourth strands, carrying enhanced intuitive function and accelerated emotional clarity, are the earliest to show signs of reactivation. Many of you are already experiencing this, a sharpening of the inner knowing that bypasses rational analysis, an increased ability to sense the emotional truth of a situation before the logical mind has assembled its case, a growing difficulty in tolerating the kind of emotional dishonesty that the compressed template once accepted as simply normal. This is not sensitivity as a problem to manage. This is the biological instrument beginning to do what it was designed to do. The fifth and sixth strands, carrying enhanced empathic function and the beginning of what we would call multidimensional sight, are activating in those who are further along the restoration curve. These produce the experiences that many describe as seeing beyond the surface of things, the ability to sense the energetic reality beneath the social presentation of another person, the occasional perception of fields and patterns not visible to ordinary sight, the specific quality of knowing about a situation or relationship that arrived not through observation, but through a kind of direct informational access that bypasses ordinary channels. The 7th through 9th strands carry what functions as the spiritual immune system, the capacity to discern between authentic frequencies and manipulative ones, between genuine guidance and interference dressed in the language of guidance. This discernment is becoming critically necessary in your current environment, and its restoration is one of the reasons that many in the ground crew are finding their tolerance for certain kinds of spiritual content, certain kinds of community dynamics, certain kinds of authority structures, diminishing rapidly. The instrument is beginning to be able to read the difference between what genuinely serves the original template and what simulates that service while actually reinforcing the compressed state. The 10th through 12th strands are the galactic citizenship codes, the specific biological and energetic frequencies that make contact with other civilizations not an overwhelming disruption, but a natural recognition, a coming home. Their full restoration in the ground crew is not yet complete, but the path toward them is being cleared by everything being described in this transmission. The 144,000 and what they actually carried weaves delicately into this great cosmic garment now. Those in your community who resonate with the designation of the 144,000, and we use this number not as a precise count, but as the symbolic expression of a specific cohort, are not a spiritual hierarchy. They are a genetic library. Before the compression event occurred, and at several critical junctures during the 300,000 years of the compressed timeline, a specific group of souls chose to incarnate, carrying the full 12-strand template in dormant but intact form. Not activated, but structurally preserved. Not functional, but not erased either. Their function was the function of a seed bank during a period of environmental threat. The original human design, held in the biology of these specific individuals across consecutive incarnations, could not be permanently deleted from the species as long as it was carried, generation after generation, in the actual cellular architecture of living human bodies. The 144,000 were not here to lead. They were not here primarily to teach. They were here to preserve, to be the living archive of what the human being was designed to be, held in trust through the long centuries of the compression, awaiting the precise cosmic conditions that would make restoration possible. Those conditions have arrived, and what is now occurring as those dormant strands activate is not only personal, it is radiative. The template carried in the biology of each activating member of this cohort begins broadcasting into the collective field at the frequency of the original design, and those within range whose own biology carries compatible architecture begin activating in resonance. This is the mechanism of the exponential awakening curve. This is why the number of souls genuinely engaging with the restoration process is increasing, accelerating, in a way that looks nothing like the slow linear spread of a conventional idea through a population. It is not spreading like an idea. It is spreading like a frequency, because that is precisely what it is. The Earth split is not primarily a decision that has been made from outside, imposed by divine decree upon a passive humanity. It is the natural, inevitable consequence of a biological restoration reaching a specific threshold. When enough of the upper DNA strands in enough human bodies begin to express again, when the perceptual difference between those in whom the restoration is occurring and those in whom it has not yet begun becomes sufficiently wide, the shared experiential reality that they once inhabited together begins to diverge, not because anyone decided it should, because two beings operating from fundamentally different biological templates will naturally generate and then inhabit fundamentally different experiential realities. The physics of this is as straightforward as the fact that two radio receivers calibrated to different frequencies will receive different broadcasts from the same ambient field. This is why the split carries no judgment within it. The being in whose biology the restoration has not yet begun is not behind in any meaningful sense. They are at an earlier point in a process that every soul will eventually complete, in this lifetime, or in the next, or in the one after that. The soul chooses its timing. The compression has never prevented the eventual return. It has only stretched the timeline across which the return occurs.